Hello, and welcome to this section on Introduction to VPC Networking. So in this particular section and in this lesson, we're going to start to talk about VPC networking and the fundamentals of how we start to set up our applications in AWS Virtual Private Cloud. So let's do two things here. First, over here in the Orion papers, let's again dive down through the physical and networking architecture layer to get to the proper diagram that we want to use for this lesson. So again, we're going to dive into a region. Then we'll take a look at availability zones. And now we're going to show the VPC. And this is what we're going to talk about in this particular lesson. We're going to now dive into a VPC and understand everything that is going on under the hood here. The first thing that I want you to understand is that a VPC within a region spans availability zones, and because of that, also spans multiple data centers. So we're going to get into more detail about that and why that's important later on in this lesson and in this section. So now clicking on VPC networking, we now get a more networking pure view as we've now moved from the physical layer, meaning the regions and availability zones and data centers, to actually looking now at how routing and how networking is actually set up in AWS. So things like Route 53, CloudFront, and S3 for things like static web hosting and DNS failover, we're going to go into later on in this course. But for now, I want to dive into specifically the VPC. So let me just talk about what's going on in this diagram before we go even further. Up top here, we have customers and we have AWS users. And the customers represent a group that are going to access a fully functioning web application, generally through an HTTP protocol using a web browser. Then we're also going to have our AWS users, and these are people that are going to access our EC2 instances or RDS servers using protocols like SSH and RDP to do administration and maintenance on those particular instances. So when we take a look here, when we have a fully functioning web application, we're going to use something like Route 53 for DNS for our front end so that we can have a common language domain name like www.linuxacademy.com point to our application within our VPC. However, for our back-end users or AWS users that are just accessing the EC2 instances that are within our VPC, they're just going to do that directly through something like an SSH protocol. So if you see here where we have the blue line representing the customer or the front-end access going through something like Route 53, the purple line representing our AWS users or back-end access comes in directly and does not go through something like Route 53. So now let's click here on VPC1, which is our default VPC versus a user-created VPC, and we'll go into what the differences are. So here, we have now dived into the VPC, and I want to quickly describe what's going on in this diagram, and then we're going to talk specifically about what VPCs are. But again, we have our customer and front-end access represented by the blue data line. And then we also have our AWS or backend users represented by the purple line. And these lines represent how data is flowing in and out of the Amazon VPC. And what are all the layers, services, and features that the data needs to go through in order to, one, get to EC2 instances or get to RDS, and then to go back out to the various users. So about this diagram, we're going to notice that we have our VPC. You can see the container here. In this diagram, I have represented here two availability zones. Now, you can have 3, 4, or more availability zones as part of your VPC, but just for the purpose of this diagram, I have two separate availability zones. Then you remember that within each availability zone is where the actual data centers are, where you provision things like an EC2 instance or an RDS server. So here, this would represent an EC2 instance provisioned in this availability zone within the VPC, within a particular region, and here this represents an RDS instance provisioned in this availability zone, a separate availability zone from this EC2 instance, and again, within the same VPC, within the same region. So with that context in mind, now let's take a look at exactly what a VPC is and some of its definitions, benefits, and purposes. So an Amazon VPC, what it does is it enables you to launch Amazon Web Services or AWS resources into a virtual network that you've defined. The virtual network closely resembles a traditional network that you'd operate in your own data center with the benefits of using the scalable infrastructure of AWS. So a VPC is designed to resemble basically a private on-premise data center or a private corporate network. So then we can look at what are some of the features of generally a private network that are also available for AWS VPCs in the cloud. So we have private and public subnets. We're going to go into great detail about what those are later on in this section. Also, scalable architecture. We're going to talk about that in great length as a part of this course. Also, the ability to extend a corporate or on-premise network to the cloud and make it a part of your network. And this is done through VPN. We're going to talk about that specifically in our hybrid section. Next, let's talk about a few important facts that you really need to know about Amazon VPCs, and that is a VPC is housed within a chosen region. So if you remember when we drilled down in the Orion papers to this particular diagram, the first thing we did is we selected one specific region. So a VPC is always housed within one single region. But again, a VPC does span multiple availability zones within that region. If you remember, so this is what allows you to provision redundant resources in separate availability zones while having them accessible on the same network. And this is, again, the foundation for high availability and fault-tolerant architecture. And again, we're going to talk a lot about that throughout this course. AWS also provides a DNS server for your VPC, so each instance has a host name, just a nice feature. However, you can always run your own DNS server by changing the DHCP option to set configuration within the VPC. So again, let's touch on some more benefits of the virtual private cloud. So you have the ability to launch instances into subnets. You also have the ability to define custom CIDR block ranges inside each subnet. You also have the ability to configure routes between subnets via route tables. Again, we're going to talk about these concepts in great detail in this section. Continuing on, we have the ability to configure an internet gateway to provide a route to the internet for resources launched inside the VPC. So obviously, if we launch resources in the VPC, they need some way, an access point to reach the outside internet and then also to accept traffic from the internet. The ability to create layered network resources. Also, the ability to extend your on-premise network into the cloud with VPN, VPG, and an IPsec VPN tunnel. Again, we'll talk about that in our hybrid networking section. And then also layered security. So we have instance level security groups, which is a firewall on the instance level, and then also subnet level access control lists, which are firewalls on the subnet level. So now talking about the default VPC. So when you create an AWS account, it automatically comes pre-built with an already configured VPC. So the important thing to know here is that the default VPC has a different setup than non-default VPCs. And we're going to go over what both of those are. And also we're going to have a lab later on in the section where we're going to go over how to create a VPC from scratch. The default VPC is meant to allow the user easy access to a VPC without having to configure it from scratch. So if you're unfamiliar with how to create and provision your own VPC, you can just use the default VPC and immediately launch instances into the VPC within seconds and get up and running on an application without having to go through all the dirty work of creating a VPC yourself. In the default VPC, all subnets have a route to the internet via a route table and an attached internet gateway. So again, it comes pre-configured, and the important thing to understand here is that all subnets, in this case in a default VPC, are by default public. And we're going to go into detail about the difference between public and private subnets later on in this section. Also, each instance launched in the default VPC by default has public and private IP addresses. And this is actually defined by settings on the subnet. Now, we're going to go into greater detail about private and public IP addresses during the EC2 section of this course, but it just is important to understand that whether or not an EC2 instance defaults to either having a public IP address or not having a public IP address when launching it within a VPC, that is a setting that you can actually adjust and change yourself. So now let's talk about some VPC limits. So these are important to understand as there are some restrictions that are placed on your account when they're first created. So you can only have 5 VPCs per region. Now, the important thing to know here is that you can request to have more VPCs per region by submitting a request to AWS. So if you remember during the console tour and navigation, I made reference to using the support tab here and submitting a ticket. Well, this would be something where if you needed more VPCs in a particular region, you can submit a support ticket. AWS will review your account and you can have more VPCs per region approved. And you can do this for almost any service that has limits on it like VPCs do. So also, 5 internet gateways per region, and this is equal to your VPC limit because you can only have one internet gateway attached to a VPC at any particular time. So if you have 5 VPCs, you only need 5 internet gateways. And we're going to go into much more detail about internet gateways further on in this section. Also, 50 customer gateways per region, 50 VPN connections per region. And again, both customer gateway and VPN have to do with setting up hybrid networking environment, so that's why those values are equal. 200 route tables per region with 50 entries per route table. 5 elastic IP addresses, and we're going to go into much more detail about elastic IP addresses during our EC2 section of this course. 500 security groups per VPC. 50 rules per security group. And 5 security groups per network interface. And it's important to understand here that security groups, although generally referred to as being on the instance level, are technically on the VPC level. So a lot of times throughout the rest of this course, you're going to hear me refer to security groups as security on the instance level because you are generally always attaching and configuring security groups when working with instances. But technically, they are still a part of the VPC. They're on the VPC level. They are not a part of an EC2 instance. It's something that is layered just above or outside of an EC2 instance. So again, just coming back to our diagram and what we're going to cover in the next few lessons of this section is we're going to talk specifically about routing. And so how data comes in, what the purpose of an internet gateway is, how route tables work. Also, then after that, talking about security, where we're going to talk about network access control lists, security groups, and how everything works with subnets within the VPC. Now, taking a look over here on the console, to access the VPC section and to start to view all of these, all we need to do is come here under Networking and Content Delivery and click on VPC. And if you've created a fresh account like I have here, you will see that we have one VPC in this account, and this will be your default VPC. Now, clicking on the default VPC, let me bring this up here, we can see various pieces of information. So we have the VPC ID. This is how you identify the VPC. We have the state, which is available. You can see the IPv4 CIDR block range. We can also see the associated route table, the associated network access control list, the tenancy, which we'll talk about later on, and then also whether or not this particular VPC is the default VPC, which it is. You then see other options here for subnets, route tables, internet gateways, elastic IP addresses, network access control lists, security groups, so all the other components that we see here on our diagram. And we are going to go into extended detail of these components in the next few lessons. So that was a brief introduction of the AWS VPC, what it is, its benefits, the default VPC, and some of the limits that are imposed on the account, which again, most of them you can have raised if you submit a support ticket to AWS. So for now, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.